Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Brear, and welcome to episode 74 of the NFS FinTech Insider Breakfast Show. Bit of a different location this morning. So, as you might have noticed, this is not my usual office. I've actually had to come into London, so we're going to be recording this actually from the 11FS offices. So, I'll be here probably for the best part of the week, but we're going to continue to do the same show. The only difference is that I've got to be wearing one of these masks when I'm walking into work. So, but all is good. For anybody who hasn't been into London for a little while, it's a bit weird. I'm not going to lie. Traveling in on the train and having a mask on, the limited amount of people, all of the shops that are closed, it does feel very sort of post-apocalyptic right now, I have to say. But anyway, for anybody who doesn't know, in this show, what we bring the best and the brightest around the fintech and banking landscape every single weekday straight into your homes at 8:30 BST. So from what we're going to be doing today, as always, having a great guest on. Today I'm going to be joined by James Vaccaro, who is the Executive Director for RePattern and a Special Advisor to Triodos Bank. On this morning's show, we're going to be talking about how the bank and the financial institutions can play their part tackling really big, impactful things like climate change, and actually how we build towards a much fairer, much more sustainable economy all round. So James is just coming in very shortly. In the meantime, as you know, we've got a whole great range of guests that we've got on for the rest of the week. Tomorrow, I've got Gary Turner on from Xero. Gary's always very, very entertaining in terms of the setup. And Xero is a company who I've got a great deal of admiration for. They've been scaling their operation amazingly well. And actually, even in these times, saw some really interesting statistics came out yesterday about the impact of COVID that Xero has been able to see across their customer base. So I'm hoping that will be a really good show for you guys. But we'll see where that kind of goes. I think James is joining us now, but if we can get him on the line now. James, I think you can hear me now. It is, James. Good to see you. Good. Well, thank you for joining us. I know you're having a few little technical difficulties this morning, but I can see you perfectly well now. So hopefully Tobias will flick the switch and everybody else will be able to see you as well. But I've given you a good build up, so I think everybody's expecting a great show now.
Okay.
Well, tell me a little bit, James, about your background then. How did you get into what you're doing?
So I started with Triodos Bank over 22 years ago, and I'd sort of come fresh out of university and thinking about what to do as a sort of a recent graduate, quite politically motivated, interested in environment and social issues, and kind of stumbled across this quite new startup at the time. It was kind of, I suppose, a challenger bank in the days before that term existed. But it was much more than that. It was really an institution which was founded on values in terms of what is it that you can do with money for social good. And I was kind of blown away because it was kind of being able to kind of marry up what I really believed in and what I was passionate about with something which felt like a real and proper job, and so got very involved with renewable energy, with organic farming, with social enterprise, and lending, and being able to put money to work in terms of positive impact. And I basically went from there and started the investment business, which I grew, which was Renewable Energy Infrastructure Fund. We raised money for companies like Cafe Direct, Ecotricity, the Ethical Property Company. We distributed the Microfinance Fund across emerging markets. We did a lot of work with some of the early social impact bonds. And then from there became had built a business in the UK, and then this European bank, as Triodos Bank is based in the Netherlands, went to the group in the Netherlands and was group director of strategy, and was quite involved with some of the other sort of things which went beyond even the bank's domain, so into the UN, setting up the UN Principles for Responsible Banking with UNEP FI, being able to advocate for change across the banking sector towards greater sustainability, and that's kind of been my sort of trajectory. And now I'm back in the UK, independent, but still very much in sustainability, sustainable finance, and looking at how we get new sustainable business models.
Yeah, I mean and again, this is something that impacts everybody, doesn't it? And actually, it's amazing how few organisations have really taken it seriously for such a long period of time. But we're starting to see quite a significant change in almost consumer demand, aren't we? In terms of people now want, and I think particularly the younger and younger generations expect the organisations that they use and bank with and work with to kind of reflect their morality and the values that they aspire to. So, I mean, have you seen over that period, have you seen a real change from a consumer perspective? And do you think that the change will be consumer led to increase the impact?
I think so. I think that for many years in the past, financial industry has kind of inadvertently built up a huge firewall so between customers and what it is they're doing with their money, and that has not served citizens very well in terms of their economic citizenship, the possibility to kind of really show up in the world and be able to kind of direct your money in the way that you want. And I think that as you get cracks in the system through new innovation like crowdfunding, impact investment, things which kind of disrupt it, things like COVID, which make people kind of a bit more conscious about what's going on, people suddenly wake up to the agency that they could have with through money, if only they could actually kind of get their hands on the tools. And there's campaigns, for example, like Make My Money Matter, where people are suddenly waking up to, or this pension money, which is kind of theirs, but is not really directed in the way that they see fit. And I think millennials are voting with their feet much more through social bank accounts, social impact investment. And I think that this is something which is only going to build as consciousness about these issues increases.
It does feel that. Can you tell us a little bit about RePattern as well? This is something else you're involved in.
Yeah, so RePattern is me effectively. It's being able to continue some of the things which I've been doing with Triodos, mostly looking at how do you start new business models. So at the moment, everybody's saying, well, the old way hasn't been very good. We need to shift to new sustainable business models. But how do you do that? And there's often times where you kind of have a lot of value creation, but not necessarily the right underpinning value conversion into money to be able to make the business model work. And that relies upon often lots of different groups of stakeholders coming together in different ways to be able to recognize what is it that's valued. So if you take a practical example in natural capital, and Triodos is getting quite involved in that, there's lots of amazing projects. There's been quite a few in Scotland I've been talking to recently, where, for example, if you want to do something which is restoring nature and protecting water sources and preventing flooding and doing all these things, you can bring together something into an investable form, for example, in wetland restoration or reforestation. But it requires lots of stakeholders to come together to agree what the value is they're creating and to be able to convert it enough to be able to make that business model work. And that's the kind of thing which I'm getting involved with diverse groups and with the finance industry.
Very interesting. And how does that turn into, like you say, to your point, how does that roll up into an investable thing? Because essentially, reforestation makes sense. Preventing floods it's almost a preventative measure, isn't it? So I mean, the insurance industries are gonna love you, but turning it into something that has investable returns is quite a difficult thing to do, I would have thought.
Yeah, so it is, because often, I mean, and this is where trying to reconceive finance as a verb rather than a noun. So finance is something which you do to be able to bring those contracts together, those relationships, those patterns of relationship into a healthy balance, where things like resilience are valued and can be valued. And I think that some of the lessons in the last few months is that actually we might value resilience a lot more than we might think. It's just that we kind of go to sleep when we're not necessarily kind of needing it immediately. And I think that being able to kind of bring together the different agencies, this is what happened a lot of times in social impact bonds, where, for example, you would get specific kind of payments for outcomes which kind of make something more resilient in the long term, and that whether that's in youth unemployment or in homelessness or whatever, that principle of thinking about what it is you want to do and being able to invest early to save yourself the sort of the much higher costs and the much more intransigent problems if we get it wrong by not underinvesting and then having to kind of clean up the mess. And there's probably no greater example of that in the world than climate change. And that's one of the things which is definitely unlocking quite a lot of investment from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds like a very dumb question. So apologies for the dumb question, but is it on the individuals, do you think, to worry about and invest into preventing, adverse climate change, or do you think it's a governmental responsibility to set the agenda around those things, or is it, why should we worry about climate change in the first place? I guess is probably the simplest question, but it's quite there's a lot of layers in that. So knowing we've only got half an hour, then
Sure.
Technically, I think we could talk about that one all day, right?
But I think it's a great question and in a way, that's the fundamental sort of idea behind RePattern, which is people are fundamentally concerned about climate change. People are becoming increasingly concerned that their money is going into stock market, which is underpinning a sort of 3.5-degree world that you couldn't draw a pension in, and you couldn't really expect your children to live in the same way that we've lived, if at all life is going to be that possible. And therefore governments become just one way of being able to have collective agency in doing something about that problem now. And I think that it is about governments, but it's also about businesses. It's about local authorities. It's about all sorts of new partnerships and platforms which kind of bring these things together. I think that one of the problems has been, if you only look for the one agency who's going to sort everything out, then you probably end up with insufficient value conversion, and then you get disappointment because things don't happen. Whereas if you get everything together in some new constellation, then once you've got that flow going, no one would say, well, we don't want that anymore. That's the trick, being able to kind of get that collective awakening and all the parties aligned in time. Yeah. And there are seeds of that happening.
It's a very difficult subject matter to sort of. There's an education process and then there's a responsibility process, isn't there? Because I mean, I'm a big believer that I think everybody, given the option A or B, is like who would like to stop climate change and adverse effects of it. I think everybody would say that they would want that. I think when it comes to on the finance side of things, it becomes almost I think that's where the rubber hits the road, which is, I think at that stage, people think about their individual situation rather than necessarily the greater good. But like you say, that's because there hasn't been options on that side of things to give people a real balance. And actually, I mean, we've seen ethical financing actually performs incredibly well, doesn't it, in the market? In fact, much greater than many other funds out there in terms of where it's going. So do you think now we're really at like a critical mass? It's like there is awareness, there is understanding, and there is actually options to really have the impact that we want them to.
Yeah, I think what you described there is a pattern. I think we get into a habit of acting in transactions as opposed to relationships. And I think that one of the biggest kind of the decisions which kind of societies face really, and sort of one of the biggest kind of issues to kind of face collectively is, how can we keep going? Can we really keep going in terms of a transaction mindset, even if it's been quite a deeply embedded behavior that we've kind of adopted, as opposed to relationships and thinking about the wider context, the systemic context. I mean, if you take COVID for an example, I think where there's been a great awakening, if you only have a transactional mindset, then you sort of say, oh, suddenly people go, oh, we suddenly value nurses and doctors. But you can't just allocate more nurses and doctors. It's not a stock market thing where you kind of would say, press a button and there they come. Nurses and doctors are a product of years of training, education, experience, a whole culture of being able to be looked after within their system, to be able to be there for us when we need them most. And I think that the more that consciousness kind of comes to fore, the more that people kind of enter more into that relationship way of being, that relationship paradigm, to go, how do we give those people what they need to be ultimately able to give us what we need when we need it? And I think that will come into the paradigm of how we invest as well, because how we invest today is going to determine the world that we have tomorrow.
Yeah, completely. I mean, that's essentially it's a proxy for shared responsibility, isn't it? I mean, I think there's many countries out there that I think have moved almost kind of nanny state. You know, I mean, it's people devolve their decision making and responsibility for these big things to the government and believe that the government should be making these decisions. It's not about me recycling, it's about the government making big changes. But do you think, I mean, with COVID, we've obviously seen in some examples, people, I mean, obviously this weekend, you know, the UK has reduced the lockdown, you know, pubs are open. A lot of people went crazy, right? Because they don't feel that shared responsibility for what's happening right now, but a lot of people do, don't they? So is that, and I think we've seen similar things, not just with finance, but healthcare as well. Actually, there are many countries that provide, like we do with the NHS, there's a more shared responsibility for it being your health, but we're here if you need us. And like I say, I think that's the critical thing with this, as you say, it's like, it's getting people to really believe in solving the problem, but then take action, like you say, on a day-to-day basis in terms of the decisions that they make, or actually even the ramifications of the impact that they do. But I mean, how has a COVID panned out from your perspective? Because obviously, you know, going from, as you say, sort of international, and suddenly we're sort of very well contained. How are you finding this period?
I mean, for me, actually, I mean, I'm just down the road from you. I think I'm here in Norwich, and actually being able to connect with people quite flexibly and more adaptably is actually kind of quite liberating.
Yeah.
And I've you know, and I'm very aware of the fact that we're well set up here, and it's been a busy time, and very aware of privilege and real gratitude, but going back to what you were saying on people being able to kind of have that collective enabling to do the right thing, I think that one of the most important institutions which can be done through are financial institutions. So I'm still working a lot with banks and the banking sector, and I think that there is this kind of growing realization that when we see things like climate challenge and the need to kind of move the whole economy, shift all of the different industrial sectors towards a net zero, fair economy, that is something that people can do, take direct action through their, you know, the relationships they have, which are collectivized through their banks or their funds. I've been working with a group of MPs in a project called Bankers for Net Zero here in the UK, looking at, well, what is it that within the relationship between businesses and banks that we can actually do to be able to kind of help this kind of pathway to invest, because businesses are also kind of, they're wanting to do the right thing, but it's not so easy to be able to just on their own figure out how they're going to a paper that I wrote recently for the Climate Safe Lending Network, which is in the US, but it's transatlantic, looking at how do we take the carbon out of credit. People are really worried about the fact that they are investing in things which are high carbon and part of an old economy. They know that they need to transition, but what's the response? What's their agency, and how can they support and encourage and even kind of go a little bit further to pressurize banking institutions to go that extra mile? And you see that banks are moving, and some of them are sort of recognizing that this kind of is part of their leadership agenda for the future, because that is how they're creating value for society as opposed to converting value for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be fascinating, isn't it? I think we're already seeing COVID be such a catalyst from a business model and technology basis. I wonder if it is going to be a real interesting catalyst for the creation of a more inclusive economy. Do you think it will be that?
I think that, like anything, I mean, I think technology has got huge potential, but it's about what are the challenges it's trying to seek to solve here. And I think that, you know, there's an awful lot of attention on certain kind of aspects of it, again from the transactional base. I mean, things like payments, but ultimately, no matter how good it is and how much convenience you can get, a payment which is as fast as light speed is not going to solve climate change for us. It's not
Sure.
going to solve the extraction of resources from the earth. It's not going to solve inequalities. There are, however, insights which technology can bring to the surface, different perspectives of where value is being created and not being converted in a way to be able to kind of sustain itself in a regenerative way, that if it can actually bring that to the surface, it can help underpin trust within communities. I mean, actually, the biggest kind of technologies which have kind of come up from COVID have just been those WhatsApp groups which have kind of connected communities to be able to care for one another. And that actually becomes more this social technology, which people can actually kind of organize some of their economic life to be able to kind of be genuinely in line with their values. And I think there's huge opportunities as well to deal with the complexity of some of these transitions. And you know, I've been working on things from natural capital to the hydrogen economy, or some new social enterprise business models, where actually technology can absolutely facilitate that kind of that transformation.
Yeah. I mean, it is a fascinating topic. Like I say, it's such a broad ranging thing that impacts literally everybody. You know, everybody on the planet is affected by how organizations kind of do this. Do you think the challenge here is that the balance between any publicly listed company or even VC backed company for that matter, I mean, their objective is the returns for their shareholders, their returns for the VCs. Do you think, though, that actually it's only when we start to see, impact funds or, ESG funds that outperform their, non sort of aware predecessors? Do you think that will be the point where we start seeing real change in the market, or do you think it will come before then? Because, I mean, the pressure is always with, big banks, big companies, carbon offsetting is a PR exercise. It's not core to the values of the things that they're doing. It's a side thing that they do. Do you think it has to be built into every product to then make everything that, I mean, by definition, that is what sustainability is, right? It's making everything that you do sustainable, not just paying a penance for it on the side.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm not at one with everyone in the sustainability industry in this, but I don't think that it needs to necessarily be because ESG funds outperform everything else that basically you've baked everything into the price. I think that it is because people will reconceive what price means, that they reconceive the fact that maybe what's value converted into money is not necessarily the only value that exists. I think that people recognize, for example, fiduciary responsibility as in people's best interests. So if you're a pension fund, you begin to recognize that that isn't just about the highest return, because the other assumption that, well, the world will always be there and we'll always be able to kind of rely upon nature and other kind of living systems, that's breaking down in front of our eyes, and it's breaking down because of some of the exploits of the financial system. So I think that it's about an underlying shift in decision-making processes, which is ultimate. Why do people make decisions? Well, because they have a slightly different picture, and they see that money is important, but it isn't everything. And its incompleteness is actually, comes to the surface at times like COVID, where money can't buy you all the things which kind of allowed you to have the life that you had before. Yeah. It doesn't buy you health or protection from pandemics. It doesn't buy certain things. There's an incompleteness. So there's a complementarity. And because there's a complementarity, you need to think, well, how are we caring for all of this? And we do this quite naturally as human beings. I mean, when we make decisions about things in the family, it's not like, oh, well, is there enough financial return for me to look after the kids? it's done from another place, and I think that that other place is fundamentally human, and isn't something we need to kind of be worried about as being an entirely alien concept. It's actually returning to things which are much more natural in terms of how we feel about it.
And is that, I mean, I completely agree with all of that. I think, is that your hope for the future of financial services then, that it becomes a little bit more human?
I think that, to be honest, it's what I see already in the trend. And I think that it is going to become one of the key aspects of leadership. I think that people have been unsettled by the lack of humanity in some of the financial services exploits of the past. They're now sort of at this kind of tipping point where actually it won't be acceptable anymore for financial institutions to not be able to show their own humanity, for people who work within financial services to be able to kind of show up as their whole selves rather than compartmentalize, and for individuals who are customers to feel empowered to do the things which they believe in. So I think that it is the journey is starting, and for sure those transactional habits which we talked about earlier, they die hard, and it's still very endemic in a lot of the financial industry. But I think it's dying out, and I think in any sort of culture which is dying out, in its last throes, it grips as hard as it can. But I think that there is a new trend. There is definitely a new awakening amongst the millennial generation. I think that's going to be a huge driver of change in the next few years.
Fantastic. Well, like I say, it's a subject matter that affects us all. James, hopefully we get at some point a chance to have a pint in a Norwich pub and chat about this much more. But unfortunately, we've come to the top of the hour, so we're going to have to let everybody go and get on with their busy Mondays. But thank you so much for joining me, James. Where can people find out a little bit more about you and what you're getting up to now?
So I'm at repattern.org, and you'll see all the list of things that I'm doing up there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us. Really, like I say, fantastic subject matter. Loads and loads of questions over on LinkedIn that we couldn't get to. So go and check those out. Guys, if you've got any more questions about this particular subject matter, then feel free to drop me an email at david@11fs.com, and I'll connect you into James as well. But that's all we have for you today. We'll be back tomorrow, though, with Gary Turner, who is the co-founder and managing director over at Xero. I was saying at the top of the show, but those guys have been doing some really interesting things, even in the lockdown period. And I think Xero is a product that I think are really sort of setting a bit of a trend in terms of actually how to do transparency, how to do openness. And Gary's a lot of fun as well. So that's all we have for you today, though. We'll see you the same time, same place tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe. Goodbye.